Hey there. In this video, we'll be discussing about callback functions in JavaScript and how they are used to handle asynchronous operations. We'll be starting from the very basics, but the main objective of this video is to touch upon the things that other tutorials miss out on. For example, things like how callback functions, which are by nature not asynchronous, are being used to handle asynchronous code, and what all functions and APIs out there support callbacks because not all of them do, and some of them only work with promises. So let's start with the definition of callback functions and we'll write a few code snippets to understand how they work. And from there, we'll move on to a much bigger example in Node.js where we'll be writing a custom database query function which supports callbacks. Now for writing the snippets, I'll be using the blank page on Chrome, which you can open by just typing about blank in the address bar. And then in the console, we'll be writing these snippets. So let's get straight into it. Now by definition, a callback is just a normal function which is passed as a parameter to another function for the purpose of being called at a later point of time. For example, here we have two functions. The first one is called print, which takes in a single parameter called data, and it simply just logs that data. And then we have a function called hello, which takes in two parameters. The first one is called name, which is a string value, and the second one is called callback, which is a function. Therefore, when we will be calling the hello function, we'll be passing two parameters. The first one is a string and the second one is a function name. Now, one thing that you must keep in mind that you should always be passing the name of the function which acts as a reference rather than calling the function itself. So whenever you're passing a function as a callback, never execute the function by opening and closing the parenthesis. Always just pass the reference to it. So if I just execute this code snippet right here, I'm able to see the message hello John, which was a result of the two strings getting concatenated and then passing the new string to our callback function, which is simply just logging that particular string. Now don't worry about this undefined here. You're only seeing this because our hello function is not returning anything. Our actual output is here, which we got as a result of this line getting executed in the print function that we passed as a parameter. Now, as I said, callbacks by nature are not asynchronous. There is nothing within this little script that I wrote that was asynchronous, and everything is happening sequentially. So the next question should be, how are we handling async operations with callback functions? And for that, we'll be creating a very small example here itself. And as we go, we'll also be updating our definition of callback function. And now we'll improve it just a little bit by saying that a callback function is a function that is passed to another function to be executed once an event has finished. And this bit around events is important because asynchronous operations always trigger an event when they are completed. And the whole purpose of using callbacks is to be able to call them once that event occurs. And the most simple example for this is the setTimeout method. So notice here in our new script, we defined a function called callback, which simply just logs the message hello. But in the next line, we're calling the setTimeout function, where we're passing this function callback as a parameter. And then as the second parameter, we're mentioning the time in milliseconds. Now the way the setTimeout method works is that it will only execute the function that you pass as a first parameter after the amount of milliseconds that we've passed here are over. So how this fits with the new definition, the event here is 2 seconds or 2000 milliseconds, and the function that's being called later is this simple function that we have named as callback. So if I execute this script, just notice after 2 seconds, you'll get the message hello on the screen. Now the one that you received here previously was the return result of setTimeout, which we are not concerned with. Similarly, we can increase the time in seconds here. So I'll be making it 5 seconds and we'll hit enter again. And you'll notice that after 5 seconds, your result will display on the screen. Now, why does every tutorial talk about this setTimeout function? It's because it's the simplest example of an asynchronous operation. Let's just use setTimeout to force a function to become asynchronous. I'll show you what I mean by that. So right now on the screen, you're seeing a very simple add method, which takes in two parameters a and b, which will be numbers. And in the next line, it adds up the two numbers and updates the sum variable and then simply logs it in the last line. Now if we were to call this function, the result will simply be the sum of the two numbers. But let's force this function to do the addition operation asynchronously. And for that, all I will do is call setTimeout. And here, instead of defining a function separately, I'll just pass an anonymous function and give the timer as 2 seconds. So whatever instructions are executed inside this anonymous function will happen only after 2 seconds. And the thing that I want to happen asynchronously is this sum operation. So here I'll just cut it and paste inside the setTimeout. And I've also updated the log statement to have this additional text. Let's try calling our add function again. So we'll pass the two same numbers, 4 and 2. And we expect the result to be the string that sum is 6. But when we hit enter, it will show us that sum is undefined. And the reason why this happened is because JavaScript is non-blocking. So when it encountered an asynchronous operation, it moved its execution in the background where it waited for 2 seconds to get over first and then simply moved on to the next line. But since the sum will only get updated after 2 seconds, its current value is undefined, and this is the exact use case where callbacks become really helpful because we want some operation to happen once an event has already occurred, which in this case is a setTimeout timer. So let me show you how we can update this add function now to accept a callback as a parameter and help us in logging our updated sum value, which will only be available after 2 seconds. So first of all, in the function definition, we'll add another parameter called callback. And then inside our setTimeout, once the addition has already happened, we'll just call the callback function and pass the sum result to it. Since we know that this last line does not work, we'll just simply remove it. And this is basically it. Now what's important now is that we define the function that we'll be passing as the parameter. And for now, we'll just keep it as a simple log function. So this log function just console logs the data that's passed to it. Now let's call our add function again. So we'll pass the same values 4 and 2. But this time, we'll also pass this log function. And when we hit enter, you'll notice that after 2 seconds, you're seeing the sum being printed. Now let me show you another benefit of using callback functions, which is you can pass a different function. And to show you how that works, I've defined another function called printSum, which takes a single parameter called sum and then logs the message with this additional text. So remember that this function is different from our previous log function where this additional text was not there. So I'll call add function again, but this time instead of passing the log function as callback, I'll pass printSum as the callback function. It's printing the result 6, but this time it has this additional prefix. So as you saw in our two separate calls for add function, we were able to pass two different functions as parameters. And both of them were able to help us achieve the result that we wanted, which was to be able to print our sum value, which is being updated asynchronously here since it's inside a setTimeout. So far, we have established that callbacks can be used to handle the results from asynchronous operations. So the next question that I often get from my students is, how can something like a fetch call be handled using callbacks? Now this fetch call right here is a simple GET request to this particular API route. And if I just hit enter, you'll see that it returns the JSON response back. And if you don't know about it already, fetch handles asynchronous operations using promises, which is clearly evident as it is returning a pending promise. Now promise is just another way to handle asynchronous operation, which was introduced in 2015 in the ES6 standard for JavaScript. Before that, all of the asynchronous code was being handled using callbacks itself. And the answer to the question that how can we use callbacks with fetch is that you simply cannot, because fetch does not handle its success or error responses using callbacks. We can definitely wrap another function around it and force that function to use callbacks. But inherently, you cannot pass a callback to fetch. So you can't do something like this, where you're passing, let's say, this anonymous function as a parameter. So this thing is not supported by fetch because fetch does not support callbacks. It supports promises which are handled using .then notation. Back in the days of jQuery, that was supporting an API called XML HTTP request, which is just like your fetch, It is used to make API calls, but since this is an older API, unlike fetch, this was supporting callback functions. So if you see here, for your HTTP request, you had to define something called onReadyStateExchange property, which took a function as a value, and this function was basically the callback function which was getting called once your request was successful. And if you want to discuss what modern day libraries use callbacks for handling asynchronous requests, perhaps the best example that I can give you guys is that of the library Express, which almost everyone has used, where if you remember, whenever you're defining a API route handler, you're passing the handler as a callback function. Now the asynchronous event here is when the server is up, whenever the user hits on a particular route, only then the callback function is called. Next up, let's try to create a custom asynchronous function in Node.js which handles its response using callback functions. And for that, we'll be using a library called MySQL2. Now, MySQL2 is just a client library used to connect your Node.js server instance to your MySQL server instance. And it will be perfect for our example because it uses callbacks to handle the query responses. So if you see here, after you've created a socket connection to your MySQL server, you can just simply run connection.query on that very connection, and the two arguments that you need to pass, the first one being the query itself, and the second one is a callback function which has access to error and results parameters. Hence, we can use connection.query to create a custom function which queries a user with a certain ID, and then we'll be handling the MySQL server response using callbacks. And for that, here on VS Code, I've created a file called custom callback fn. I've already installed the package called MySQL2, and here in this function called fetch customers, I'm creating a socket connection by using MySQL.createConnection, and then on the connection object, I'm running the query select star from customers where ID equals to 1. So I'm trying to fetch just a single customer details. Now notice here I have not used callbacks yet. So if you try to execute this particular line, your result will be undefined, because connection.query just doesn't work like this. Hence, I'll be removing this particular line and I'll uncomment this bit here. And this is the code which will actually work. Here, along with the query, just like the documentation says, I'm passing a callback function which has access to error results parameters. So here, I'm just logging out the results. Let's save these many changes. And then after I'm done defining the function, I'm just calling the function back. So here in the terminal, let me execute this particular file by using node, and as you can see, we're getting the details of the user with ID 1 back. So now let's try to handle the response by passing a callback function to this fetch customers function. So instead of doing this, here I'll just be passing a callback function, and to our connection.query call, I'll just simply be passing the second argument as callback. Now the two parameters that a callback handling a connection query call should have are the error and results parameters. So here I've defined a function called print user details, which will have exactly two parameters by the same name of error and results. And in the function definition, I'm just saying if there is an error, print out the error, else print out the result that you're getting back from the database. Let's try calling our fetch customers function again, but this time, since we also need to pass a callback function, and we'll be passing this particular print user details function, let's add it to the call as a parameter, and let's just move this line after the function is defined. We'll save the changes, try to hit our script again, and as you can see, we're getting the proper response back. Now just to show that you can pass any function as a callback to fetch customers, and as long as it is handling these two parameters, it will give a proper response back. I've defined another function called print username, which is doing almost the same thing, but instead of printing out the entire object as it was doing here in our previous print user details function, it is only printing the first name field of it. So this time we'll call the function fetch customers again, but instead of print user details, we'll pass print user name as the parameter. We'll run a script again, and as you can see, this time it's only giving us the first name back. So this is basically how you can define a custom function which is using callbacks. All you need is a function which supports callbacks. So this was it for the video. If you guys still have any doubts, please do let me know in the comment section down below. Please leave a thumbs up if this video helped you, and subscribe to this channel for more such content. I post new videos around programming every week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.